You just have to kind of hit the down arrow key here, I think. The peace and the truce of God.
So I have the peace and truce of God. Okay. All right, so the search for peace. So the early feudal world was filled with a lot of violence, which put those people that were either peasants or anybody that wasn't in the military force and places at risk. But beginning in 989, regional church councils in southern France demanded that warriors reconcile defenseless people with this special peace from violence. Later, other churches in the same area of France expanded the peace movement by legislating periods of truce, which all normal fighting was prohibited. It is doubtful that such efforts immediately influenced the behavior of most warriors. The peace movement had several long-term consequences. So in 1095, a French Pope, Urban II, universalized the peace movement for all of Western Christendom, by calling for an armed expedition to the Holy Land as an effort to export violence from Christian Europe. The result of this was the First Crusade. So the peace movement also helped engender within Europe's professional warrior class a developing awareness that its members had special responsibilities to the Christian community. And the two documents that follow come from an age in which the peace movement was just getting underway as a localized phenomenon. So the peace of God, it was a proclamation issued by local clergy that granted immunity from violence to non-combatants who could not defend themselves, beginning with the peasants and with the clergy. The practice spread to most of Western Europe over the next century, surviving in some form until at least the 13th century. Excommunication would be the punishment for attacking or robbing a church, for robbing peasants or the poor of farm animals, and for robbing, striking, or seizing a priest or any man of the clergy who is not bearing arms. Children and women were also added to this protection. The Pax Day, which is the peace of God, prohibited nobles from invading churches, from beating the defenseless, from burning houses, and so on. But a synod of 1033 added merchants and their goods as well to the list. And then the truce of God. While the truce of God is a temporary suspension of hostilities, the jurisdiction of the truce of God is broader. The peace of God prohibited fighting on Sundays, and it was the sanctification of Sunday which gave rise to the truce of God, for it had always been agreed not to do battle on that day, and to suspend disputes in the law courts. But it confirmed permanent peace for all churches and their grounds, the monks, the clerks, chattels, all women, pilgrims, merchants, and their servants, cattle and horses, and men that work in their fields. And that is all.
Okay, the truce of God, the peace of God. All right. Yeah, this has to do with rules for fighting. That in fact, there were rules of engagement, and some of these had to do with the church itself, setting these up. All right, we're being recorded now. Pope Leo and the mosaic at the Lateran Palace.
His Lateran mosaic.
The Lateran mosaic at the Lateran Palace. No doubt.
This is his entire mosaic. The whole
That's
Lateran
beautiful.
mosaic. It is.
Is it flat or is it actually?
No, that's part of it is in a dome.
It's a cupola.
Thank you for that new word.
However, the only part that was focused on in the book was that little part in that little white box over there.
All right.
Yeah, right. It is located in the Lateran Palace in Rome. It was completed sometime between 798 and April 799, and it was part of Leo III's plan to make Rome beautiful.
Make it beautiful. Why not?
Yeah.
Make Rome beautiful again.
Yes. Merba. So, in this little part of the mosaic, there are three individuals. You have Saint Peter, who's in the middle there.
Right.
You have Pope Leo, who's on the left, but on the right side of Peter.
Of course.
And you have Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, on the right side of the
Big
mosaic.
Chuck.
So, what are some of the things that they have, that they possess? Well, St. Peter, he has the keys to the kingdom of heaven in his lap there. He's also wearing a pallium, similar to the one that he's handing to Pope Leo.
Pallium.
A pallium.
Very good. That's a good word. Another new vocabulary word.
He,
It's kind of the vestment, the sash.
yeah, kind of, he's dressed in clerical robes, so similar to Pope Leo.
Right.
If you look at the halos or nimbuses around their heads, you can
Nimbus,
see
there's another new word.
Leo and Charlemagne have square nimbuses, whereas Peter has a circular one. And that is because if you have a circular nimbus, that signifies that you are a canonized saint. But if you have a square nimbus, that signifies that you are a living individual who's been sanctified or is an extremely powerful individual.
Yes. I like it.
So, with his right hand, with Peter's right hand, he's handing Pope Leo a pallium, and with his left hand, he's handing Charles a lance. There are also some inscriptions on here. The first one, I numbered them on there. The first one is saying Saint Peter. The second one, Most Holy Lord Pope Leo. The third one, next to Charlemagne, says to Lord King Charles. And the fourth one, at the very bottom, says, Blessed Peter, you give life to Pope Leo, and you give victory to King Charles. Yes. So, what is my take on this? And based off of the questions that the book asks, of course, because I wouldn't go above and beyond and do...
You wouldn't?
No.
Or you would? Oh, okay.
Depends on what it is.
All right. So you're just going to do the bare minimum?
I'll do the bare minimum, yes.
Okay. All right. Just check why.
So, one of the questions the book asked was, why is there any significance that Leo's on the right side of Peter and not his left? And one thing that came to mind is the fact that Christ is on the right side of God. So perhaps it's a way of showing, it's alluding to that. Pope Leo is kind of Christ in this position. He's on the right side of God. You have Charles, who's, you have your spiritual leader, you have your military leader, in a way. Pope Leo is spiritual. Charlemagne, he's a military leader. But there are some big problems with this mosaic, because what we're seeing is not what existed when it was created. It was very badly deteriorated from time, and in 1743 they attempted to remove it so they could restore it, but they ended up destroying it in the process.
Oh, no.
So they had to put a completely new one up. And so what we're seeing is not the original, and it's not entirely credible or trustworthy.
Fake inscription.
Fake inscriptions. See, it occurs.
Fake mosaic.
Propaganda.
CNN.
So, the bottom inscription, a lot of the words were not...
the bottom part down there in the blue?
Of the original inscription, before it was destroyed, it was pretty hard to read. It wasn't very it wasn't, I guess you could say, readable. I'm trying to think of the word. Intelligible. Intact. And so we don't have an exact translation. We don't know exactly the wording that existed. So this here is a guess, but most likely not the actual inscription that existed. So we're not, this source essentially is not the real source. It's kind of, it's a fake
later
source.
reworking.
Yeah. It's kind of a quasi-transcript.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. Well, we see that Peter, of course, is considered by the Roman Catholic Church to be the first pope. And so, since Pope Leo is not the first pope, but he is on the right, This sort of sets up also a long controversy in Europe, and that is the investiture controversy. Who should invest the bishops with their power? And in fact, who has the power? Who has the ultimate power? Is it Charlemagne? Or is it the Pope? Is it the king or the emperor or the Pope? That's sort of number one. Obviously, God's number one. God's number one. But then after that, who down here on earth? So we have spiritual and the temporal world, right? The temporal means it's temporary, to pass away. And so because of this, the church normally assumes they are the most powerful because they are the permanent thing. What Leo is doing with the church shall never fall, the church shall never fail. What Peter binds. You see here, you didn't point it out, but the keys you can see it up there. Okay, good. The keys on his belt, because Peter has the keys to the kingdom, right? So what he is going to do will be in heaven as well. All right, so this does set up a long controversy then. Who has the ultimate power? And when that actually comes into play is when you need to invest or set up a new bishop. Who gets to choose who the bishop is and actually set up with the power? So this sets up the investiture controversy, goes on for quite a while. Here.
Okay.
All right, Collins chapter 19. Right ahead. Anytime you're ready.
Push the down arrow.
Yeah, this is the down arrow. Should make it go down. Yeah.
For this?
No, just on the keypad. There's a little arrow that's down.
Okay, is this the down arrow?
Uh,
Oh, I see. It's right here.
yeah, try that one. Right here. Oops.
Okay. Yep.
Just hit that. See if that works. Is that working? That's not working.
No, I think I'll just do this.
Yeah, let's do that. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
So yeah, I did the Collins presentation on the desolation of the pagans. And for the Vikings, the first attacks and invasions of settlements and monasteries were obviously in Britain and Ireland and the Channel and Atlantic coast of France. This all began in June 8th, 793. And most of these attacks were sometimes on an annual basis, so it's kind of part of life, so they were used to it at this point. The Vikings, from their native home of Scandinavia, were migrating to new places, and that's also what they were known for. And Vikings were in a more general term, were people who were raiders, traders, and sellers, usually not like from a native, warrior culture. So, and they were most likely, obviously, from the Scandinavian peninsula, like Norway and everything, and Sweden and whatnot, and Finland and Denmark. And about the historical information, most Scandinavian literary and historical information sources are much later than the mid-11th century, like when they were recorded, and the information we have about the Vikings before this time is probably not very reliable, since, everything was so very limited back then. And most of the reliable sources from the Viking period come from the runic inscriptions, which are, people that are like historic Viking people, like how there's Celts before, the Irish people in Ireland and Germanics before Germans in Germany, and yeah, most of these come from the runic inscriptions on stones, and most, like, here's a runic inscription, and most of them are usually memorials, which do not provide very much information, and most evidence and information about the Norse raids come from the 9th and 10th century West Frankish and Anglo-Saxon annalists. And about the Viking raids, there are several different ideas of what caused the Viking raids, and most likely there is not really one single big reason why the Viking raids were violent and destructive, and the people who were attacked, which were usually, monks and whatnot, tried to understand the reason for the Viking attacks, and after an attack on a monastery, people in the community considered it divine retribution, kind of like how they thought Attila the Hun was a scourge of God. And the Alcuin's writings provided this information. And the raids and plundering that took place around the British, Irish, and French coasts were shocking to the people in those areas, and there was such a big difference in the values of those societies and the raiders. And the raiders, the Vikings, were pagans and found the monasteries easy prey for looting. And during the first period, raids on the Norwegians were quite small and limited, and the Danes experienced worse attacks on a larger scale that was caused by migration across the sea. And this is for their trading part, and for trading up here. During the 7th and 8th century, there was growth in new trading routes around Scandinavia. And with the increase of ports, there was an increase in trading settlements. And Danish kings took advantage of the situation and started charging tolls for the merchandise that went through the ports. After a time of economic growth in the 8th century, much of it was lost in the only to be later lost in the 9th century. And civil wars broke out among the Danes after the murder of Godofred. And this changed the peaceful times of trading and led to more raiding, and the ships made trading better during that time, but it also gave pirates the opportunity to raid and loot. And for the Viking attacks, the Frankish emperor tried to remove the Saxons into exile to Francia, and which he attempted ethnic cleansing even before Hitler. And this caused Danish attacks, and there was a great conflict between the Franks and the Danes. How do you pronounce it? It's not annals, right? Annals. So the Annals of Saint Burden, during the years 830 to 832, records that the Frankish king was not very effective in taking action against the raiders. He's probably incompetent. So the Vikings created difficulties for the military. And you're probably wondering why you see a Muslim guy here. It's probably because the Vikings, traded with different peoples and everything, and I wouldn't be surprised since Islam was, rising during this time, so not shocking. And from 836 and the attacks on Dorset and Frisia moved forward, the records show that the Danes were attacking the monasteries, and their towns caused a depopulation of those areas because they were also taking slaves as captives. They would hold the people for large ransoms. After the fall of Rome, slave trade greatly decreased. And during this time, there were new Scandinavian settlements with the need for imported slaves. And the Vikings took advantage of this opportunity and raided Ireland more viciously in an attempt to capture people for the slave market. And they were kind of like mercenaries because they were hired to fight. Come on. And it's interesting that during 858, a group of Vikings went to fight for Charles the Bald. At that time, the Vikings were well known, and there were less available looting opportunities for them, and their slave captive activities were very well known. The situation made them open to fighting Charles the Bald. However, this time did not last long. The Vikings soon returned to their raiding in western Francia. In the 10th century, the Frankish leaders accepted the Viking settlements, and this was actually successful for both the Vikings and Francia. Oops. During the end of the 9th century and the beginning of the 10th century, Vikings that were mobile Danes moved around, looted, and raided different areas. And they lived in camps during the winter and moved during the spring. The areas where the Vikings were successful in their looting and slave trading attracted other mobile Viking groups to the same areas in hopes of making the same great profits. And for Christianity, evangelism and missionary outreach spread Christianity among the Scandinavian peoples that began in the early 9th century. And there was great growth of Christianity during this time, and converted the former pagan Scandinavians. And then Scandinavians encouraged others to convert as well. And by 1000, Christianity had spread to the major Scandinavian settlements from Iceland to Kiev. So that's all I gotta say.
Okay. Thank you. I don't think we have any others today. Let me say a few other things before we have to go.